The air inside the orbital chamber felt heavier than space itself. Outside the curved, reinforced glass, Earth hung in silence. Blue, fragile, wrapped in thin white clouds like a memory of peace. Inside, every breath seemed to echo. Delegates from 7 alien civilizations sat in their designated arcs, their postures stiff, their expressions unreadable behind masks, chitinous plates or shimmering energy fields. At the center of it all, the human delegation stood, no longer seated, no longer negotiating. They had just done the unthinkable. It started weeks earlier with a single grain of dust, or rather a single microbe. Proxima b, humanity's last real hope for survival after centuries of climate disasters, rising oceans, and resource wars, was finally ready for transformation. Machines the size of cities had spent decades melting ice caps, releasing oxygen and seeding soil. Billions had been spent, millions had worked. Generations had dreamed of walking under alien skies that breathed like home. But then came the Council's verdict. The Qatari, tall, silver-skinned beings whose voices sounded like wind through crystal, had stood and declared Proxima b sacred. Not because they'd found cities or civilizations there, but because their ancient texts spoke of sleeping life in its red soil. To them, terraforming wasn't colonization, it was desecration. The rest of the Council, bound by centuries of protocol and mutual distrust of human impulsiveness, agreed. No more atmospheric processors, no more biodomes, no more hope for weeks, Earth's diplomats pleaded. They shared data, scans, soil samples, atmospheric models, all showing no signs of life, complex or otherwise. But the Council didn't want data. They wanted obedience. You are young, the Velen envoy had said gently, their many eyes blinking in slow unison. You must learn patience. The universe is not yours to reshape, but patience had run out on Earth long ago. On the day everything changed, the human lead delegate, a woman with tired eyes and a voice that had carried through too many funerals, stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't gesture dramatically. She simply said, "We will not beg to survive." Then she tapped a small device on her wrist. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. On every screen, across every network, a message flashed in 1,000 languages. Effective immediately. Earth and its affiliated colonies withdraw from the Galactic Concord Council. Silence. Not the quiet of empty rooms, but the kind of silence that follows an explosion, stunned, disbelieving, thick with consequence. The Qatari representative swayed slightly as if struck. The Mirkal, insect-like and pragmatic, tilted their segmented heads in what might have been respect. Or alarm. No species had ever left the Council voluntarily. Some had been expelled. Some had vanished. But none had walked away by choice. Back on Earth, people watched the live feed in homes, schools, refugee camps, and orbital stations. In Mumbai, a child paused her homework. In Nairobi, a farmer looked up from his drought-resistant crops. In the floating cities of the Pacific, elders whispered prayers, not to gods, but to the future. No one cheered. No one cried. They just absorbed it, like a deep breath before a storm, because everyone knew this wasn't just a political move. It was a declaration. Humanity was no longer asking for a seat at someone else's table. They were building their own. Within hours, the effects began. Trade routes froze. Ships carrying medical supplies from the Sireth, a gentle aquatic species known for their healing nanites, were recalled. Emergency alerts flashed on colony networks. Ration essential meds. Await updates. On Mars, a child with a rare lung condition stopped receiving her weekly treatment. Her parents held her tighter that night, not saying a word. Yet strangely, there was no panic. Not yet. Instead, something quieter spread, resolve. Engineers in lunar shipyards worked double shifts, retrofitting old freighters for independent supply runs. Scientists reopened archived projects on synthetic biology, desperate to replicate alien medicines with Earth-based tech. In classrooms, teachers stopped talking about interstellar cooperation and started teaching self-reliance. The woman who'd spoken in the chamber, she didn't give interviews. She went straight to a small observation deck on the station alone. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched Earth spin below. She thought of her grandmother, who'd survived the Jakarta floods. Of her nephew born on Luna who'd never seen rain. Of the millions who'd pinned their hopes on Proxima b not as an escape, but as a second chance. She hadn't wanted to leave the council, but staying would have meant betraying everyone who believed in that second chance. News feeds across human space filled with mixed reactions. Some called it reckless, others called it brave. A few called it the beginning of the end. But in the quiet corners of the internet, in encrypted forums and handwritten letters sent via courier drones, a new phrase started appearing. We walk alone, but we walk together. Meanwhile, far beyond human space, the council convened an emergency session, not to discuss sanctions or retaliation, but to ask a question none of them had considered in centuries. What if we were wrong? The Qatari remained silent, their faith shaken not by data but by the sheer weight of human conviction. The Veln quietly reviewed old records of early human history. Their wars, yes, but also their art, their music, their relentless drive to rebuild after every collapse. For the first time, the council saw humanity not as a problem to manage, but as a mirror. Back on the orbital station, the human delegation packed their belongings. No one spoke much. There was no gloating, no bitterness, just the quiet hum of systems powering down, the soft click of suitcases closing, the distant thrum of a shuttle preparing to take them home. As their ship undocked and turned toward Earth, the stars outside seemed different, not colder but clearer, as if the universe had taken a breath and decided to watch closely, because something had shifted. Not in laws or borders, but in spirit. Humanity had chosen uncertainty over submission, and in doing so they hadn't just changed their own fate, they'd reminded the entire cosmos that dignity isn't granted, it's claimed. The day humanity left the council wasn't the end of diplomacy. It was the birth of something new, something raw, something human, and the universe, for the first time in a long time, leaned in to listen. 6 months after Earth walked away from the council, life didn't collapse, but it changed. Not with explosions or invasions, but with quiet shortages, longer lines, and the slow drip of things that used to just work, now needing to be fixed, replaced, or done without. On Luna Colony Alpha, the air still smelled faintly of metal and recycled water, but now there was a new scent underneath. Worry. The medical bay, once humming with advanced alien nanites that could stitch cells back together in hours, now relied on older Earth-made drugs. They worked mostly, but slower, with more side effects. A child who scraped his knee during a school drill now had to wait days for it to heal properly. His mother didn't complain. She just kissed his forehead a little longer that night. At the heart of it all was a scientist who'd once spent her days translating alien poetry and decoding cultural metaphors for diplomats. Now she spent her nights hunched over flickering screens in a dim corner of the research wing, sifting through old council data packets, ones that hadn't been officially cut off yet, just slowed. She wasn't looking for weapons or secrets. She was looking for truth, because something didn't add up. The official reason the council gave for blocking Proxima b was potential microbial life. But every scan Earth had ever run showed nothing, just dust, rock, and frozen carbon dioxide. Yet the Qatari stood firm, not with data, but with something deeper: belief. Their sacred text spoke of the sleeping breath beneath red soil, a life form so subtle it didn't breathe oxygen or leave fossils. To them, disturbing it would be like tearing pages from a holy book. The scientist, let's just call her the translator, had spent years learning their language, not just words, but the rhythm of their thoughts. She knew they weren't lying, but she also knew science, and the gap between faith and evidence was growing wider by the day. Back on Earth, the government doubled down. We can't let superstition decide our future, the Planetary Council declared in a global broadcast. Terraforming on Proxima b resumed at full speed. New atmospheric processors lit up the planet's surface like constellations being born. Hope returned, but it felt fragile, like glass held together with tape. Meanwhile, in the colonies, people adapted. On Mars, engineers jury-rigged old water recyclers using parts from decommissioned rovers. In the orbital farms near Jupiter, farmers crossbred Earth crops with genetically hardened strains to survive without the Council's nutrient enhancers. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Humanity had survived worse: ice ages, plagues, world wars. This was just another storm, but storms wear you down. One evening, in a small apartment on Luna, a young technician stared at a broken comms unit. It used to connect directly to the Veln medical network. Now it was just dead weight. He sighed, opened it up, and tried to rewire it to tap into Earth's emergency band instead. His hands shook, not from fatigue but from fear. His sister, back on Ceres Station, was waiting for a heart valve replacement. The Earth-made version wasn't ready yet. Every day without the Veln nanites was a roll of the dice. That same night, the translator received a message. Not through official channels, those were watched, but through an old academic back channel encrypted and buried in a data stream about asteroid composition. It was from a Qatari archivist, someone she'd once shared tea with during a cultural exchange. The message was short. They fear you not for what you do, but for what you might become. She read it 3 times. Then she pulled up every council vote from the past century. She noticed a pattern. Every time a species pushed boundaries, asked hard questions, developed new tech, challenged old rules, the council responded with caution, then control. Humanity wasn't being punished for terraforming. They were being contained for daring to imagine a future outside the council's script. The silence from the stars wasn't just absence. It was pressure. Yet even in isolation, humans found ways to connect. A musician on Titan started broadcasting lullabies over open frequencies, simple tunes on a handmade flute, meant for no one and everyone. Within weeks, replies came in, distorted hums from a Mirkal trader, watery chimes from a Sirith scout ship drifting near Neptune. No words, just sound. A reminder that even in silence, we're not alone. The translator began writing again, not reports, but letters. She sent them to old contacts across the council species, not asking for help, just sharing human stories. A grandmother teaching her grandchild to grow potatoes in lunar soil, a group of kids building a telescope from scrap to watch Proxima b turn blue. She didn't know if they'd read them, but she had to try, because the real danger wasn't running out of medicine or spare parts. It was losing the belief that other beings might still care. Then came the day everything almost broke. A supply ship from Earth, carrying the first batch of homegrown antivirals, was delayed by a solar flare. On Luna, 3 children came down with a mutated strain of flu. The old Earth vaccines didn't work well enough. The medical team worked for 36 hours straight. 2 recovered. 1 didn't. There were no riots. No blame, just grief, quiet and heavy. At the memorial, people held candles made from recycled wax. Someone played the Titan lullaby on a cracked speaker, and in that moment the translator understood. Humanity hadn't just left the council. They'd stepped into the unknown with nothing but each other, and maybe that was enough. Back in her quarters, she opened a new file. Not for the council. Not for Earth Command. For history. She began typing. We are not reckless. We are desperate. And sometimes desperation looks like courage to those watching from afar. Outside her window, Earth glowed in the distance, still blue, still breathing, and for the first time in months she allowed herself to hope. Not that the council would come back, but that humanity wouldn't lose itself in the trying, because survival isn't just about air, water, and medicine. It's about holding on to who you are when the universe stops holding your hand. And right now, across 100 scattered outposts, humans were doing exactly that. 1 repaired machine, 1 shared meal, 1 quiet act of stubborn kindness at a time. Life has a funny way of cracking open when you least expect it, even in the cold silence between stars. A year after Earth walked away from the council, something strange began to happen. Not with fanfare or declarations, but in the quiet corners of space where rules blur and survival demands creativity. On Neutral Zone Station Eos, a rusty, spinning outpost halfway between human and Mirkal territory, trade wasn't supposed to happen. Officially, all commerce with Earth was frozen, but officially doesn't feed hungry mouths or fix broken life support systems. So unofficially, things started moving again. Not weapons, not secrets, just stuff. Spare oxygen filters, protein bricks stamped with old Earth logos. Even seeds, real Earth-grown tomato seeds wrapped in foil and passed hand to hand like contraband hope. The Mirkal, those many-limbed traders with eyes like polished obsidian, never said why they started doing it. Maybe they respected the human choice to stand alone. Maybe they were just tired of the council's endless caution. Whatever the reason, their freighters began docking at Eos with excess cargo that mysteriously vanished before inspections. And in return, they took human-engineered solar cells, cruder than council tech but cheaper, tougher, and easier to repair. Then came the data packets. No one saw them coming. One morning, Researchers on Mars woke to find encrypted files in their public science servers. Inside, climate models, atmospheric stabilization algorithms, even blueprints for water purification systems, all signed with the subtle, swirling glyphs of the Sireth, the ocean-dwelling species known for their quiet wisdom. No message. No conditions. Just knowledge offered like a hand reaching across a dark room. It wasn't charity. It was something deeper. Recognition. Back on Earth, people didn't celebrate. They got to work. Engineers cross-referenced the Sireth data with their own models. Within weeks, drought-stricken regions in what was once the Sahel saw their first reliable rainfall in decades. Not from machines, but from tweaked weather patterns guided by alien insight. Farmers cried in their fields. Not from sadness, but from the shock of abundance returning. But the real turning point happened on Eos Station, in a dimly lit archive no one was supposed to access. The translator, the same one who'd spent nights decoding Qatari poetry, had been invited there under vague pretenses. She arrived to find a Qatari waiting, not in official robes but in simple traveler's garb. Their silver skin shimmered faintly under the station's yellow lights. No guards, no translators. Just two beings who once tried to understand each other across a chasm of culture. They didn't speak at first. The Qatari handed over a small crystalline drive. Inside wasn't data about Proxima b or sacred microbes. It was something older, much older. Records, not of triumphs but of failures. Of a species called the Gorax. Peaceful, slow-moving, with skin like moss and voices like rustling leaves. They'd lived on a lush world near the galactic rim. The Council had deemed their planet strategically vital during a resource crisis centuries ago. The Gorax asked for time, for dialogue, for mercy. The Council voted. The planet was strip-mined. The Gorax vanished. The official history called it a necessary sacrifice for galactic stability. But these records, hidden by a Qatari archivist who couldn't forget, showed the truth. It was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, and the Qatari, despite their spiritual talk, had voted yes. The translator sat in silence for a long time. She finally understood. The Council wasn't evil. It was afraid. Afraid of chaos. Afraid of change. Afraid of species like humanity who refused to wait for permission to live. And in trying to control that fear, they'd repeated the same mistake, only this time. The species they tried to silence was loud, stubborn, and still breathing. Word of the Gorax records didn't spread fast, but it spread among scientists, among traders, among the younger members of Council species who'd grown up hearing only the polished version of history. Doubt once planted is hard to pull out. On Luna, a group of students started a project, Lessons from the Silence. They collected stories, not just human ones, but whispers from Meyer Call pilots, Sireth drifters, even old Qatari folk songs. They broadcast them on open channels not as propaganda but as questions. What if cooperation doesn't mean obedience? What if progress doesn't require permission? Surprisingly, someone listened. A Meyer Call envoy, unofficial, unannounced, landed on Mars, not to negotiate, just to observe. They walked through hydroponic farms, watched children learn physics through holograms, sat quietly as engineers argued over engine designs. Before leaving, they left a single gift, a small device that could convert Martian dust into breathable air with 90% efficiency. No strings, just a nod. Back on Earth, leaders debated what it all meant. Some said it was a trick. Others said it was weakness. But most just felt tired. Tired of walls, tired of suspicion, tired of acting like the universe was a courtroom where humanity was always on trial. The translator returned from Eos with more than data. She carried a new idea. Maybe the problem wasn't the Council itself, but the idea that there had to be one single authority deciding what was right for everyone. What if instead of one table, there were many? What if species could choose who to trust, when to share, and how to grow without needing a central gatekeeper? It sounded naive, dangerous even, but after a year of silence, it also sounded like freedom. And then, something unexpected happened on Proxima b, a routine soil scan, just a standard check before deploying the next wave of oxygen trees, picked up something odd. Not life exactly, but complex organic chains, dormant, curled tight like seeds waiting for rain. They weren't like anything on Earth. They weren't like anything the Council had ever catalogued. The discovery wasn't announced. Not yet. But it changed everything. Because now humanity faced a choice. They could ignore it, push forward, finish the terraforming, pretend the data didn't exist. Or they could stop, not because the Council told them to, but because they chose to, because they'd seen what happened when fear overruled respect. The translator looked at the scan results and thought of the Gorax, of the Qatari archivist who risked everything to share the truth, of the Mirkal trader who slipped tomato seeds into a cargo hold, of the child on Luna who still carried a scar from a wound that should have healed in hours. Humanity hadn't left the Council to become gods. They'd left to become responsible, and responsibility, it turned out, wasn't about power. It was about pause. As news of the organic traces quietly spread through scientific circles, a strange calm settled over the colonies. No panic, no blame. Just a shared understanding. This was their moment. Not to prove they were right, but to prove they'd learned. The universe hadn't changed because humanity walked away. It changed because, for the first time, humanity was willing to look in the mirror and choose differently. The red dust of Proxima b swirled in slow motion under an alien sun, kicked up by the treads of a soil sampling rover. It looked like any other routine scan, just another day in humanity's boldest project. But this time, the machine didn't just measure minerals or radiation levels. It found something else. Something small. Something quiet. Something that shouldn't have been there. Complex organic polymers. Dormant. Structured. Not random chemistry, but patterns. Like a language written in molecules waiting for the right conditions to speak. The data came in at 3 a.m. local time. The junior xenobiologist who saw it first didn't shout, didn't run, just sat very still staring at the screen, heart pounding like a drum in a silent room. They'd been trained to expect nothing. Proxima b was supposed to be dead, empty, ready for human hands to shape it into a new home. But this was life. Not trees or animals, not even bacteria as we know them, but something alive in its own way, sleeping beneath the rust-colored surface for who knows how long. They reported it up the chain, and that's when everything changed. Within hours, Earth Command issued a quiet order. Classify the findings. Do not share. Do not publish. Continue terraforming as scheduled. The reasoning was simple, even if it hurt to hear. Billions had been invested. Millions were counting on this world. Colonies were already being built in orbit. To stop now would mean chaos, economic collapse, lost hope, maybe even unrest. We can't let uncertainty derail survival, the message read. But the scientist, the one who'd spent nights decoding alien truths and staring at Earth from the void, couldn't let it go. They'd seen what happened when fear overruled honesty. They remembered the Gorax, the silence, the erasure. And now humanity stood at the same crossroads, holding the same power. So they did something dangerous, something human. They leaked the data, not to enemies, not to the Council, but to independent journalists, academic networks, and open-source science collectives across every human settlement, from the domes of Mars to the floating labs above Venus. They attached a single note. We found something. Decide together what it means. Within 12 hours, the truth was everywhere. At first, there was disbelief, then debate, then division. In the orbital shipyards, workers argued over lunch. If it's just microbes, does it matter? It's not about size, it's about respect. On Earth, town halls filled with people shouting over each other. Some said, "We've suffered enough. This planet is ours now." Others said, "If we destroy life just because it's small, what makes us better than those who destroyed us?" Children drew pictures of tiny red creatures in school notebooks. Grandparents told stories of how their ancestors once paved over forests without asking, and how the world paid the price. The government tried to regain control. Press conferences were held. Experts were trotted out. But the genie was out of the bottle. People weren't waiting for orders anymore. They were talking, listening, thinking, and that was the real revolution. Because for the first time, the choice wasn't being made by a handful of leaders in a sealed room. It was being made by millions, by farmers, teachers, engineers, kids, elders, each weighing survival against conscience. Meanwhile, far away, the Council watched. They didn't send messages, didn't gloat, But their silence this time felt different, not cold, but curious. Almost hopeful. Back on Proxima B, the terraforming machine still hummed. Atmospheric processors pumped oxygen into the thin air. But now every worker moved slower. Every decision felt heavier. A team installing water pipelines paused when their sensors picked up unusual soil vibrations near the discovery site. They didn't dig. They marked the area, reported it, waited. That small act, choosing to wait, meant more than any treaty ever could. The scientist who leaked the data didn't hide. They turned themselves in, not in shame, but in clarity. "I didn't betray Earth," they said during their hearing. "I trusted it. I trusted that when faced with the truth, we'd choose to be better, not just stronger." The hearing wasn't a trial. It became a conversation. Broadcast live, raw, real. People cried. People argued. But no one turned it off, and then something beautiful happened, a vote. Not by governments, not by militaries, but by the people, through secure, verified networks across every colony and continent. One question: should terraforming on Proxima B continue as planned, or pause for deeper study of potential native life? The count took 3 days. Billions participated. When the results came in, the margin was narrow but clear. Pause, study, respect. Earth Command didn't fight it. They announced the halt the next morning. Not as surrender, but as evolution. "We came here to build a future," the broadcast said. But a future worth living in must be built on truth, not convenience. On Proxima B, the great machines powered down one by one. The red dust settled. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. The scientists stood on a ridge overlooking the half-built colony, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors no Earth eye had ever seen. They thought of the tiny life sleeping below, unaware of the storm it had stirred. They thought of the child on Luna with the scarred knee, of the tomato seeds traded in secret, of the Sirith lullabies drifting through the dark. Humanity hadn't just found life on another world. They'd rediscovered their own humanity. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between stars, the universe leaned in, not to judge but to witness. Because this wasn't the end of ambition, it was the beginning of wisdom. And that changes everything. 2 years after humanity walked away from the Council, Earth didn't look like a planet that had lost its place in the universe. It looked like one that had finally found its voice. The skies over Geneva were clear that morning, not because of advanced atmospheric tech, but because people had chosen, slowly and stubbornly, to heal what they'd broken. Solar panels glinted on rooftops that once leaked smoke. Rooftop gardens bloomed where concrete had ruled. And in a quiet park overlooking the old diplomatic district, an older woman sat on a wooden bench, watching children chase each other through patches of real grass, grown from seeds saved through decades of collapse and renewal. She didn't wear a uniform, didn't carry a title, but she'd been there, from the tense silence of the council chamber to the raw uncertainty of the first months alone. Now she just watched, listened, breathed. Because the real victory wasn't in grand speeches or interstellar treaties. It was here, in the laughter of kids who'd never known a world where hope felt like a luxury. Back on Proxima B, work hadn't stopped. It had changed. Instead of bulldozing the red soil, scientists and engineers now walked it gently, mapping the faint pulses of dormant life with tools designed not to disturb, but to understand. They'd learned to build around the sleeping patterns in the ground, rerouting water channels, adjusting oxygen flow, even designing habitats that floated slightly above the surface. It wasn't faster. It wasn't easier. But it was right. And that choice had sent ripples farther than anyone expected. The Qatari were the first to reach out, not with demands, but with questions. "How did you know when to stop?" their message asked. The reply wasn't technical. It was simple. "We remembered what it felt like to be ignored." That honesty opened a door. Soon, the Myrkal proposed a new kind of exchange, not trade under council rules, but direct partnerships between colonies and their outposts. The Sirith shared more than data now. They sent young learners to study Earth's restoration projects, fascinated by how humans rebuilt ecosystems from memory and grit. Even the Veln, once the strictest enforcers of protocol, began quietly attending open forums where species debated ethics, not just engineering. The Galactic Concord Council still existed, But it no longer held all the power. A new network had grown in its shadow, loose, messy, and voluntary. No one had to join. No one was forced to obey. But more and more species chose to connect anyway. They called it the Web of Shared Stewardship, though most just referred to it as the Listening Circle. Earth never asked to rejoin the old council. They didn't need to. They'd helped build something better, something that didn't demand conformity but celebrated difference. Mistakes were admitted openly. Successes were shared freely. And when a new species from the outer rim sent a hesitant signal asking for help with a dying moon, it wasn't the council that responded first. It was a coalition. Humans, Mirkal, and a lone Cirith engineer, working together not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Back home, classrooms taught a new kind of history. Not just wars and discoveries, but moments of choice, like the day a scientist chose truth over silence, or when a colony voted to pause progress out of respect for life they couldn't even see. Kids learned that strength isn't just about building big things, but about knowing when to step back. On Mars, a young botanist successfully grew the first apple tree using soil mixed with Proxima dust and Cirith nutrient formulas. It wasn't perfect, the fruit was small, a little sour, but it was real. And when they shared the seeds with schools across the system, it wasn't as a symbol of conquest but of collaboration. Even the old orbital stations felt different. The medical bays now hummed with hybrid tech, Earth-made diagnostics paired with gentle miracle healing fields. No one owned the solutions. Everyone improved them. And through it all, the universe didn't punish humanity for walking away. It watched, learned, changed, because what Earth had done wasn't rebellion, it was an invitation. An invitation to imagine a galaxy where no one species held the keys to survival, where wisdom came from many voices, and where dignity wasn't granted by an authority, but earned through action. The woman on the bench smiled as a little girl ran up, out of breath, holding a dandelion she'd found pushing through a crack in the path. "Look," she said, eyes wide. "It grew all by itself." The woman took it gently. "Some things just need a little space," she said, "and a lot of patience." She thought of Proxima B, now breathing slowly under careful human hands. Of the Qatari archivist who'd risked everything to share the truth. Of the silent data packets that carried hope across the dark. Of the millions who chose every day to build rather than break. Humanity hadn't fixed the universe, but they'd shown it a new way to be, and that was enough. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks, the woman stood and walked slowly toward the old observatory on the hill. Inside, a new telescope pointed not at war zones or resource-rich planets, but at quiet corners of space where new signals, faint, curious, hopeful, were beginning to appear. She didn't know what those signals meant, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the unknown, because humanity had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true survival isn't about controlling the future, but about being worthy of it. And somewhere in the endless dark between stars, the universe kept watching, not with judgment, but with something like pride. Because the day humanity left the council wasn't the end of anything. It was the day the universe remembered what it meant to grow.